Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We're at the top of the hour, so we're going to give folks another minute or two to log on before we get started. So get comfortable, grab some water, and we'll be back in 1 minute. All right, we're going to get started. Thank you again to everyone who has joined us today. This is our Camp Prosperity Advocacy Summer Camp series. Today is the second in our 4-part series, and today we're going to be talking about values-based messaging. My name is Tupa Haveka. I'm the Program Associate on the Field Engagement Team at Prosperity Now. And before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping announcements. This webinar is being recorded and will be mailed to all registrants within 1 week. All webinar attendees are currently muted to ensure sound quality, but we want this to be an engaging discussion, so please ask a question or share thoughts at any time by typing into the questions box of your GoToWebinar control panel. And if you experience any technical issues, please email us at gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. To get the most out of today's conversation, we encourage you to join us from a quiet space. Grab a coffee or a snack and settle in. Again, we really want this to be engaging, so please send us your questions and your comments as you listen along today. You can also tweet with us, counselor, and also our Senior Advocacy Manager at Prosperity Now. Vanna?
Great, thanks so much, Tupa, and welcome everyone to session 2 in our 4-part series. As Tupa mentioned, we're really excited for the conversation that we're going to have today. Again, my name is Vanna Cure. I am the Senior Advocacy Manager here at Prosperity Now, but for the purposes of this series, I will be your lead camp counselor. In just a few minutes, I'm going to go over the agenda and briefly introduce our speakers to you all. And then we will get underway with today's webinar. So for most of you who joined us last week, you know that we discussed the basics of advocacy and provided best practices and tools for getting started. And we had both a legislator as well as a congressional staffer on that webinar to share some tips with you all. This week, we'll continue sharing tools by discussing values-based messaging for a better future. Oftentimes we hear from advocates how difficult it can be to get through to certain legislators in your state on issues of economic inequality. The issues just don't resonate with them. They are not as willing to listen. Just all kinds of issues occur in your advocacy work. So we wanted to take this session to be able to address that, to hear your challenges, and really just have a great discussion on what works and some of the ways that we might be able to tweak our messaging. Before we begin, though, I do want to issue a small disclaimer. Keep in mind that every person Every legislator has a different and unique set of values. What's presented today isn't meant to be this surefire way to achieve advocacy success, but rather tools that have worked for others and could be helpful to you all. Just keep in mind that it's just important to build relationships, build rapport with your legislators to see exactly what moves them. Our speakers for today, I'm excited. We've got two great speakers lined up for you all. The first is Heather Cabral, who is the Senior Director of the West End Strategy Team. And the second is Bernie Mazik, who is the President and CEO of the South Carolina Association for Community Economic Development. And you can see both their Twitter handles there. Feel free to live tweet during today's conversation if you all hear some things that you want to, some things that resonate with you. Feel free to live tweet them. It's always great for us to keep the conversation going on Twitter. We encourage you to use the hashtag Camp Prosperity today. All one word, Camp Prosperity. So for today's agenda, in just a moment, I'm going to do a poll question. We always like to start these webinars off with seeing who's on the call, what type of experience we have on these webinars. After our poll question, I will turn it over to Heather to go over some tips for values-based messaging for a better future. And then we'll have a fireside chat with Bernie. Bernie has a wealth of advocacy experience there in South Carolina, and I thought he would be a great person to talk to offer up some tips and best practices to you all for messaging for effective advocacy. After that, we will have a group discussion and Q&A, and then we'll close out. We'll give some next steps and close out. So our poll question for today, how would you describe your legislator's stance on your policy priorities? Would you say that your legislator tends to agree with you? Would you say that they tend to disagree with your stance? Would you say that they could either disagree or agree depending on the issue? Or are you not sure, or do you just not have enough advocacy experience? So take a moment and fill this poll out for us. Interesting results so far. I'll give you all a couple more seconds. Okay, it looks like most of you said, 45% of you said they will agree or disagree depending on the issue. Another 26% of you were unsure or don't have enough experience. 21% of you, surprisingly, your legislators tend to agree. And then just 8% of you said that your legislators tend to disagree. So that is a bit surprising. I thought those top two would be flipped. So without further ado, I am going to turn things over to Heather Cabral. I will let Heather introduce herself to you all. She has got a wealth of experience in communications, and I will just let her talk a little bit about herself first and then get into her presentation on values-based messaging. So Heather.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on today's webinar. Again, my name is Heather Cabral. I'm a Senior Director at West End Strategy Team. We're a communications firm in Washington, D.C. that uses communications strategy to create change for our clients. I've been there for about 8 years and have always worked in the nonprofit/policy space in my 15 years as a grown person. Over those 15 years, I've worked almost exclusively at the intersection of racial justice and human rights, now obviously applying a policy/communications lens to that work. So I tried to tailor some of my talk and presentation today based on some of the responses the team got on desired takeaways from today. But certainly if, I'm digging into something and you want to know more or shift gears, I'm happy to take a pause and take questions and dig in a bit more. Packaging, oftentimes this is a half-day training, so I will hope to convey some good smart tips in about 20 minutes, but certainly you all have my Twitter handle. If you've got questions, connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'm happy to answer questions more fully offline, but hopefully our time together we can get through some very valuable basics that I hope you all will find helpful. And to that, I think we can go to the first slide. So there are so many ways. I know all of you are approaching the purpose of and goals for reaching legislators in very different ways. So I think it's just important to know that there are so many ways to reach them, particularly now when we don't have the luxury of calling a scheduler and setting up a meeting on the Hill. We're in a very different place, and I'm sure it will be a long time before we can set up meetings on the Hill. But in the interim, there are some really valuable ways to reach our lawmakers. And that can be done through an op-ed, an opinion piece, either in a political outlet such as the Hill, Politico, Roll Call, even the Washington Post, or another way to reach them through an op-ed is in the newspaper that's in their district, right? So if you're in Boston, if you're trying to reach a lawmaker in Boston, maybe the Boston Globe is a better option, or Providence, the Providence Journal. Or if it's Florida, perhaps the Sun Sentinel. So determining your purpose might also determine the outlet that you would do an op-ed. We also often, especially now in this pandemic space that we're in, are doing a lot more digital and social media campaigns. So we might do a tweet out where we're tweeting at a single lawmaker with a specific message and giving, putting a toolkit in the hands of allies. We're also doing a lot of writing campaigns right now, call-ins, sign-on letters, and then oftentimes still too, we're doing press conferences, but obviously mostly through GoToWebinar or Zoom for now. We have had instances with some of the work that I've done where we are still giving testimony to lawmakers in their own districts. So we have done, like in Michigan, we're moving a lot of bills there. So we have had instances where we're still giving testimony to lawmakers on their turf. So these are some of the ways, particularly now, that are great ways to meet with our lawmakers while we can't be meeting with them in person. We can go to the next slide. Some of the collateral that you may want to have prepared or be thinking about, especially if you have the luxury of working with a communications person or a team, or have a good writer on your staff, it's really helpful to kind of know what you would even need to reach them, through these platforms that we just talked about on the previous slide. No matter what your plan is, I would always start with a talking points document. And that really, when you're thinking about the talking points that you need to convey messages to your lawmakers, you should really start first by thinking, what are your goals? Why are we trying to reach this particular lawmaker? Who is the audience? Is it just the lawmaker? Is the lawmaker and his staff? Is it the media in the lawmaker's district? So outlining the goal, like why are we doing this? Why are we reaching them? Who's the audience? Is it just your lawmaker? Or is it an entire committee that they serve on? And then what is the message? Once you know the goal and the audience, and thinking strategically about what your message is and what it is that you want to convey. And then finally, in thinking about your talking points, what are the tactics? What are the things we're going to do so that we can reach those lawmakers? Another, once you've got a solid frame of talking points, you can turn that into lots of other pieces of collateral that give you many ways and options to reach your lawmakers. So I mentioned that a digital campaign is a means that we've all been using in these past 4 months since we've been in quarantine. So I think if you have somebody on your team who could put together a digital media toolkit so that it makes it easy for people to support your message. So that would be draft social media posts, right? Draft e-newsletter content, so that if you're sending out a weekly newsletter and somebody puts some easy messaging in your hands, you're just copying and pasting. And I think now you want to make reaching lawmakers and crafting a message as easy for your supporters or your staff as possible. And so that's a good way to start, is to just have a plug and play toolkit that allows people to jump in and support you and your messaging. I think a good example of this, obviously right now, if for those who are following and engaging in the Black Lives Matter movement, I follow the local Black Lives Matter chapter here in Washington, D.C., and they put content out on their listserv all the time. So there may be a particular day where they are asking supporters to share a specific tweet, or if you're an organization and have an opportunity to put content in your newsletter, they're constantly sharing plug and play material for their supporters. And I think that's the same with just about any movement, but the easier you can make it for your supporters, and supporters could be your staff, supporters could be people in your community, people in your church, ally organizations, but the goal is always to make it as easy as possible for people to be supporting your work. And sometimes in that same toolkit will include things like a sign-on letter, and those can be done. Every organization has their own platforms, but with the organizations that I work with, we most often use platforms like Salsa or MailChimp or Every Action, or some of the more popular ones. But they're just tools that allow you to craft your sign-on letter and then invite people, whether you're pushing it out on social media or through your newsletter, asking people to sign on to whatever it is, the messages that you're sending in a particular letter. And this goes back to the talking points, right? So as long as you've got a solid set of talking points, you can refurbish them for all of these pieces that you see here on screen. So you could also say, on Friday, July 28th, I want everybody to call Representative Bass. I want everybody to call the Ways and Means Committee. So as long as you've already got your talking points, then you can easily turn that into a script, a sign-on letter, social media posts. And we do that often. Now we're doing call-ins a little bit less, only because phone lines on the Hill are a bit overwhelmed with fewer staff answering calls in person right now. But certainly, and inshallah, when things return to quote unquote normal, call-ins are a great way. Inundating the lines of a lawmaker that you're trying to reach is always a great way to push and move a message. And then finally, draft op-eds and LTEs, the talking points that you put together. What we often do, particularly if we're doing something like a statewide campaign, is put together a draft bullet points for an op-ed with details on how to write a good one for lawmakers, which is typically 600 words, depending on the outlet. And we'll take those talking points and give them to, if you're a state like Florida, where you might have 5 major newspapers in the state, we'll find a leader in each of those 5 markets to draft an op-ed. We'll give them the talking points and say, take these talking points, make it your own, and then we'll go back, revisit, and then pitch to the 5 key newspapers in a particular state. It's another great way to reach lawmakers as well. If there's no questions, we can go to the next. Yep, perfect. So getting what you want, and I understand that some people have questions around reaching more conservative lawmakers. So there are some kind of studied ways to make your ask. So to reach your target and get what you want, we always use the head, heart, hand model. So the head is, we think of, okay, what is the data? What is the data that supports the work that we're doing? So for example, right now in Illinois, we're pushing for funding for trauma recovery centers across the state. So we have tons of data that says when victims of crime have access to trauma recovery centers, crime goes down by X%. So if you can share data that proves your point and your message, that's one great way to reach lawmakers. Some people don't want to hear data. Some people want to hear the heartwarming story. So that's where the heart piece comes in. They want to hear your personal testimony. You could say, I'm the victim of a violent crime. I was able to receive services in my community that helped me heal. And as a result of helping me heal, I was able to go on and live a normal life and be a productive supporter of other victims of crime in my community. So it's another way, because for some people, they want to hear the data. Some people want to hear the heartwarming or perhaps heart-wrenching story, depending on what the issue area is. And then the hand is, and I say this, never leave without asking for something. And I think oftentimes we're telling lawmakers something, but we have to make sure that we're asking them for something very specific. So when you're conveying your message, always make sure that you close your story with an ask. And an ask can be something as small as commit to showing up at our community vigil, or it could be as big of an ask as introduce this bill that's really important to your district. But the goal is always to never leave without making an ask. And I think in thinking about these three elements, what we know about storytelling or messaging or giving testimony or writing an op-ed is that there are 5 elements that if you were to hear a story, these are the elements that work best. So if we were to do a study and 10 people were to tell a story and 2 of those people only use 5 of these elements, their story wouldn't be conveyed as well as those who make sure to include the 5 elements of a good story or testimony. So setting the story, I think I'll take us all back to probably kindergarten or even before, when we first started reading, right? So the stories that we heard as children are some of the most basic ways of telling a story, but we remember them because they check these boxes. So setting the story in a time and a place, we might think it was a dark and stormy night, like you know where the story's going, right? It might instill fear. For lawmakers, it might be, it was the day after the election, and so you're now, it's the day after the election in Washington, D.C. So you're setting the story in a time and a place, and we all know what the day after the last election felt like. So you immediately bring people to a visual and probably also an emotional space before you start your story. Know your last line. The easy version that we all remember from childhood, and it sticks because it works, is, and then they lived happily ever after. The story for the version for lawmakers is probably the example that I just gave, and as a result of receiving services after I was a victim of crime, I was able to go on and live a healthy, productive life. Or it could be the opposite. Because I wasn't able to receive services, I spiraled into a deep depression. So last line is always a good way to leave, you want to leave a taste in your listeners, you want to leave something with them. And that could be something incredibly uplifting, or it could, the point is to have a takeaway, either one that's inspirational or possibly one that makes them think, maybe we do need to work on this piece of policy. Maybe we do need to pass this bill. Maybe we do need to make sure that we're meeting more often with our constituents. Then there's naming your characters. No good story, and this is the same with journalism, right? Like if there's an interview in a journalistic piece, it's more valid. Same with a story.
It looks like we may have lost Heather for a moment. I thought for a second it was my connection here. So we will.
Whoops.
Heather, are you there?
Yep.
Oh, perfect. You can pick back up. Sorry, we lost you for a moment.
Oh, I don't know what happened. So for sensory information, we want to leave people with a feeling, right? So one, right now we're in the midst of a global health pandemic. So sensory information could be, I'm extremely concerned about childcare. It's the summertime. I have nothing to do with my kids. It's 100 degrees outside. The pools are closed and tantrums are high. So what are the sensory, like what are the things that indicate feelings? And that could be something as small as I'm incredibly concerned about the welfare of my children during this global health pandemic. Something that points to what you're feeling. And then the same with shying away from emotion. How do those two pieces play off of each other? And so I think, I think this deck will get circulated, but whenever I'm writing testimony for somebody who might be speaking in front of a committee or in any hearing, really, I always try and make sure that I'm including an ask, but also writing their testimony through the lens of the 5 elements of a story. Same with an op-ed, same with a news interview. If you have an opportunity, we did something on C-SPAN 2 weeks ago ahead of the Poor People's Campaign June 20 event, and we had the luxury of 30 whole minutes on C-SPAN. So it gave us an opportunity to include several, check off several different characters, several different kinds of emotion that plays into issues like poverty, food security, housing security, all in the midst of this global health pandemic. So these are, no matter what lawmaker you're trying to reach or what audience you're trying to reach, these are all elements that are typically very helpful and I've found to be, useful, particularly when giving testimony. Reaching a conservative audience, because I work almost exclusively on racial justice, I'm only working on bipartisan issues some of the time. But when I have worked on bipartisan issues, we found really creative ways and interesting ways to make sure that we're reaching a more conservative audience. And that's all often through values-based messaging that, unless you're a completely horrible human, and probably if you're doing any work in Washington to create change, then most things that fall under values-based messaging would be applicable. Oh, we have a question. So maybe before we dig into reaching conservative audiences, we can talk. There's a question that says, can I offer more ideas and examples about sensory information? Some that I often use, particularly right now, so sensory information versus emotion. So they are often paired together. So sensory information may be, we were writing a piece about marching and the value of marching in this moment of racial justice and uprisings that are happening across the country. So sensory information is often, even though it was 95 degrees that day and we were all dripping sweat, we knew that our goal was to, make sure our voices were heard. So sensory information are things like the weather. When we were doing work in Flint, Michigan, we often talked about, we use sensory information like the tension, and you could feel the tension in the room. When we were doing work in Ferguson, we would often use sensory information like the smell of the tear gas. The tear gas was so thick that we couldn't see 2 feet ahead of us. And the emotion is often a result of the sensory information, right? So if the sensory information is tear gas, the emotion is, depending, the emotion can be many things. For some people, it was, I felt rejected by my government. I was in fear. I was angry. So oftentimes the emotion is a result of the sensory information, right? So if it's pouring rain and you're trying to make it to your lawmaker's office, then the emotion may be worry, concern, defeat. I hope that helps answer the question a bit, but most often we find that the sensory information gives you the emotion that you're looking, that helps round the story out. So we'll dig in now to reaching a conservative audience. And as I mentioned, values-based messaging can be a lot of things. I think everybody likes to think that they have a moral compass. A lot of us that are doing social justice work, racial justice work, human rights work, lead with some kind of value. Sometimes it's a faith-based value. Sometimes it's a family-based value. So when we're meeting with lawmakers, we try and make sure that we're doing research so that we best know what their values are, so that when we're creating our messaging, we're working to hit them where it may hurt. So if there's something around supporting families, if they have been somebody who gets in front of a podium all the time and talks about supporting families, but have introduced a bill that is oppressing families, then you know that that's a way to reach them and kind of hit them where it hurts. Same thing around smart spending. If they've been somebody who said, we need to be better stewards of our budgets, then what's the data? What are the stats that you can say, well, if we introduced this bill or introduced this policy or changed these ways in which our city or our state or our federal government operates, then we could save more money. One that we see often and has kind of just become a circus after President Trump held an upside down Bible, one that we find often our lawmakers have faith-based values. One that we joke about almost because I work with clergy across many faith traditions almost exclusively. So one thing we always kind of joke about that's really not funny is how many lawmakers get in front of a podium and say, well, my Christian values tell me to. And it often is something that's horrifying, and we kind of smirk amongst ourselves and say, well, my Christian values tell me to love thy neighbor, and what is happening in front of me is not loving thy neighbor. And so to do that, I know I've got to wrap up quickly, so I'll try and get through unlikely allies. So we do that through what we call unlikely allies. For us, particularly after the president's photo op with the Bible, we used the voices of a lot of white faith leaders, some that are evangelical, but would maybe fall under the bucket of not conservative, but probably liberal, but they were a means of reaching more conservative audiences. Sometimes we use victims of crime who are opposed to adding police, but instead want resources for victims because that works. We passed a bill some time back called McV, which funds early childhood intervention programs. And the way we were able to reach conservative members was to use young mothers who said, you know, because of this funding available to me, I hate, you know, this is literally how we had to carefully message it. But, you know, as a result of having access to these programs, I don't need to live in public housing. I don't need SNAP benefits. I'm able to support my family on my own. Another good example of reaching conservative lawmakers that we've done in the past is using veterans. There's always going to be a veteran who's an advocate for your goal. And one thing that worked well for us, even though Supreme Court is telling us differently, is Amendment 4. We had a lot of veterans who strongly advocated for Amendment 4 in Florida, which restored voting rights to people who were formerly incarcerated. So I think when reaching a conservative audience, think about who your unlikely allies are, and they may not be so unlikely. And then communicating to specific populations, and I'll wrap up real quick and we can move on to the next panelist. But make sure you have the right messengers. As a woman, if we're talking about obstetricians or child labor and delivery, motherhood, I probably don't want to hear that from a man. If we're talking about, Christian values and I'm hearing it from somebody who's an atheist, probably not a good idea. So just making sure that you have the right messenger with the right message for the purpose of your goal, and certainly cultural competency, whether that's, do you have somebody who's representing Spanish language speakers, people who are deaf or perhaps blind. So just making sure that you're thinking through diverse messengers to reach the right folks. And then have the right message, be concise, be clear on what your ask is, and be culturally competent in your messaging so as not to have to walk back anything that you say that may not be particularly in line with your goals. That is
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. And I know we've got some questions lined up, but we're a little bit over time. Before we get into Bernie's presentation or Bernie's panel discussion, we had a question about, is there a model template that folks can use when communicating with legislators? And I'll just say quickly that Prosperity Now in our Advocacy Center, which I directed most of you to last week, it's on our website. We provide a lot of draft emails around the issues that we encourage our network to advocate for. We allow for folks to edit those. So feel free to take some of that language from our advocacy center, take some language from a lot of the blogs that we put out. We always try to make things as easy as possible for advocates. And there are enough organizations like Prosperity Now who are doing similar work to what you may be doing in the community that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I always encourage folks to steal some of our email language, steal language from our blogs or whatever. Heather, if you've got anything else to add.
We typically don't do templates only because the issue areas that we work on as a communications firm, we really try and tailor them for each individual project. But I'm happy to share anything we've drafted in the past if somebody would like to see something I've done before.
Great, that sounds good. We'll get to more questions at the end of today's discussion, but I want to shift gears a bit and get an advocate's perspective. As I mentioned earlier, our second speaker for this webinar is Bernie Mazik. He is the president and CEO for the South Carolina Association for Community Economic Development, or SCASED. And so Bernie, before we dive into our panel discussion this afternoon, I want you to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your background and how you came to be where you are right now.
Well, it was not a direct path, but I'm delighted to be part of this great discussion today. My path really began with work with the Chamber of Commerce here in Charleston and getting an understanding of workforce development challenges, and was in that field for some time, and then had the opportunity to work for a local community foundation in building the capacity of neighborhoods, largely African-American, marginalized neighborhoods, and helping those neighborhood leaders realize and understand that their conditions could change if they found their voice and exercised their voice. And as we work to provide training and leadership development support to those neighborhood leaders and provide them some small grants, those neighborhood leaders said back to us at the foundation, well, all this training is nice and that's cute, but our neighborhoods are still poor. We want you to help us to find ways to improve the economic condition of our neighborhoods. And so we shared with them a number of models, and resulted in them selecting the community economic development model. And they basically led an effort to create a CDC in Charleston and connected with other grassroots leaders throughout the state. And they came together and created a states association following North Carolina's model. And the work that they began resulted in SCASID and who we have today. So we owe our existence to grassroots leaders, recognizing that they wanted to create prosperity for themselves and wanted leaders to and the resources to make that happen.
Great. Well, I guess I owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to those same grassroots leaders who allowed you to lead the great work that you're doing at SCASID and in turn to be a part of this webinar. So let's dive into today's discussion. I want to get to as many questions as possible. The first being, just talk about a little about your core policy issues. I want folks on the phone to be able to connect to some of the issues that you work on to see themselves in your work. So talk about those issues and why they're so important.
Sure. So we focus on community economic development, which is a broad way of framing prosperity, because a lot of it depends on how a local community will determine what is important to them. Now, and so we hear a lot from our member organizations as to what the issues and the programs they want to implement locally. And so there are the traditional issues and programs such as affordable housing, workforce development, small business development, but we also work on such issues related to capital and to financial resources. So we also focus on anti-predatory lending legislation. Lately, we've been looking at broadband access, especially for rural areas and under-resourced areas, food justice issues. You would think in a country as bountiful as ours that there are not food deserts or there are not areas where people find it difficult to find food, but we have that. And so food justice issues are critical to our sector as well. Not to mention financial literacy, financial education, financial freedom are also critical issues for individuals. And so these are programs and activities that we're involved with. Lately, we've been spending a great deal of time in rural areas around land sustainability and ensuring that persons who have land, which that land is getting away from them quite a bit with the rapid development that's happening in South Carolina. So we're working to help them with the land that they have, to help them make that land productive for them. It's one thing to have the land, but it's another thing to make that land work for the landowners. And so we're doing a great deal of work around land ownership, land prosperity, and helping those landowners to make progress in that area. So those are some of the broad issues that we're focused on. A lot of what we do is provide capacity building for our nonprofit members and connecting them with financial partners and technical partners so that they can be as successful as possible with their work. So that's a little bit about the work that we do and the issues that we're focused on.
Great. And thinking more about these issues from an advocacy perspective, as you're approaching legislators with different policy asks, what type of research or just back-end work goes into determining how you're going to frame this advocacy ask when you're talking to legislators?
Sure. And I think Heather mentioned this in her presentation. We start a lot of times researching the legislators themselves. What are their issues? What are their priorities? Understanding the context that they're coming from. Especially conservative legislators, looking a little bit into their background, looking into their districts, and understanding how we can engage them and what will move them when we are presenting our policy issues. So we start with researching and understanding our legislators. Now, one thing I will say about South Carolina, which is most of the time helpful, but sometimes a hindrance, with our General Assembly, it is very leadership centric, meaning that a small group of folk will drive the agenda of the legislature. Usually it's the Speaker of the House, it's the chairman of our Ways and Means Committee, it's the chairman of our Senate Finance Committee, it's the President Pro Tem of the Senate, now the President of the Senate, and of course the Governor's Office. So we do spend a lot of time trying to understand and trying to influence those leaders, or influence those who will be able to influence those leaders. And so that does help us so that we don't necessarily have to lobby all 200 plus legislators, but we do. We do try to inform all of them. And then, of course, we use Prosperity Now scorecard. It's usually released early in the calendar year, and it oftentimes coincides with our legislative event, our legislative luncheon, or our legislative breakfast. And we usually roll out some data from the scorecard, which is very helpful in setting the stage for our work for that year. And then our legislators, especially the conservative legislators, they put a great deal of value and they measure the state's success economically on jobs, on job creation. We recently had an announcement that Walmart will be building a huge distribution warehouse in one of our counties here. Those are the kind of things they like to see, but it's also the small numbers that they want to see too. So we're always sharing and making sure that we provide the kind of data to them about the work that our members do and the number of jobs that they create as a result of their work. We also share, of course, data on housing issues and cost burden of housing, both rental and home ownership. And we help them understand that affordable housing or workforce housing is critical to teachers, is critical to police officers and first responders. It's critical to entry-level employees. And so when we're talking about housing, we're doing research about the cost burden of housing. We also want to make sure that we have data about lending and capital, and how capital flows, or the lack of capital that flows into communities. So we share a little bit about the lending that's going on, and usually trying to help them understand those conditions in their own district. We have a good relationship with our State Bankers Association. We have a number of bankers that are key partners to SCASA. So we're able to share that data and help them understand how what they do impacts how capital flows into their community. So now, because of COVID-19, but even before that, we're also talking about health conditions and helping them to understand that the social determinants of health really impacts the health of citizens of South Carolina, and especially this is important now. So because we have a high degree of mortality when it comes to communities of color in South Carolina, we talk about the lack of health care and access to health care. Of course, the inability to expand Medicaid in our state was key to that. But also, we talk about affordable housing and low wage jobs and educational attainment, all affecting the health and are all underlying conditions that affect the health of our residents. So all of these are pieces of data that we share with our legislators to help them understand the conditions that we face in South Carolina and to try to help them the dots with what we do.
Thank you for that. I want to shift a little bit in talking about, you know, the actual framing. When the meeting happens, when you're actually having these conversations with legislators, how do you stand firm in that ask? Like, how do you frame issues of economic equality in a way that speaks to those values of the legislators, but also doesn't take away from the issues that you're actually advocating for? Although those two things, the issue that you're advocating for and the legislators' values, may butt heads or may conflict, how do you sort of stand firm and make sure you're not taking away from that issue that you're trying to advance?
Well, we talk about the economy and how everyone needs to be able to participate in the economy, and we don't shy away from the fact that not all communities have access to all the tools to participate in the economy. So, you know, we talk about the disparities that exist based on the lack of access to capital, the lack of access to broadband. And so we don't shy away from that, but we also help them to understand that by investing in these communities, they're not losing. We frame a lot of the information we share with them in how the state's investment in the programs that we are promoting, there is a return on that investment. And we also share that and do the research to find out and to show how their investment, whether it's direct appropriation or whether it is a tax credit, or if it's another way of supporting our communities and our members, how our members leverage their investment and ultimately what that return is to the state as a result of their investment. So we frame it in those terms while still holding fast to the fact that, you know, these resources are needed in under-resourced areas. But the fact that we have this network of organizations that are rooted in the community and have the capability of taking a state investment and leveraging it and providing a return, they can look more favorably. They're not looking at this more as a handout, but they're looking at it as an investment. And so we're reporting back to them the return on their investment into that community. And we find different ways of communicating that to them, not just during the legislative session, but year round. One of the things that we have encouraged our members to do is to host site visits with their legislators. Because I can talk to these legislators all day, but it may not have, or it's not going to have the same impact as someone in their local district. Inviting them to their organization and to their community, showing them what is going on and how their investment through, as I said, an appropriation or a tax credit is having an impact on the lives and improving the conditions in that local community, whether it's affordable housing development, whether it's workforce development, whether it's prison reentry or citizen reentry, or whether it's job training and entrepreneurship development. So that's really a combination of how we do all of that to help legislators across a spectrum of political ideology value what we do in the community economic development sector.
Great. I've got a couple more questions here for Bernie. And in the meantime, if you all have questions for either Bernie or Heather, you can go ahead and start putting them in the questions box. I'll get to them shortly. And Bernie, I certainly agree with highlighting the return on investment. That's something that we certainly try to highlight at Prosperity Now as we're advocating for programs like VITA and free tax prep, talking about how providing these services, providing funding for free tax prep frees up money for low-income families to recycle back into the community. So that's always a good point to highlight. And some of that return data can either be found your organization, not you specifically, Bernie, but the folks who are on the line, your organizations or some agencies out there. So all kinds of organizations can provide that data on return and investment. Want to get to an example, Bernie. I'm kind of a visual person and I have to have a picture painted for me sometimes. Could you give us an example of a campaign that required you to get more creative with your messaging? We know that most of the legislators in South Carolina are going to lean more conservatively. Just give us an example of what that looked like for you all.
Sure. The example I'm going to share highlights the fact that it's helpful to build allies that are beyond your core constituents. It's important to engage other organizations and other sectors in your work, and you will find that there is some mutuality of benefit by doing that. This is an example where we engage the land conservation sector, where years before you might say that the community economic development sector was at odds with the land conservation sector. We call them tree huggers, that they would much rather spend money and policies on protecting green space and protecting the natural environment and cared less about people. Well, it took us some time to really come to a point of valuing each other's agenda. And now they're some of our best advocates when it comes to the legislature. But one year in particular, we were trying to get our community development tax credit legislation extended. And so we recruited our land conservation allies to reach out to the legislators that they had relationships with. And remember, I said in South Carolina, our legislators are leadership centric. So there were some key legislators that were allies of conservation issues, and they could be very helpful to us to get that legislation moving through the Senate. And so those conservation allies reached out to their friends in the Senate, helped them to understand how by supporting a community development tax credit, it was going to benefit them in the conservation sector. They used their own language, they used their own vernacular, they used their own relationships to convey to those senators of how important this tax credit legislation was to their work as well. And it helped to move our legislation through the Senate, and eventually it became law. So that's an example of how we engage with some of our allies to help move a particular piece of legislation forward. And we bring the conservation sector into our work around community economic development. Now we're engaging and having conversations on the issue of expanding broadband and food justice. And so again, engaging a diversity of sectors in our campaign to address these huge issues is really the only way we see ourselves being able to move these agendas forward.
Great. And one final question for you, Bernie, and then I'm going to open up the floor for our attendees to get questions from them. We know that, of course, right now we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and among the things that it has done over the last several months is really put a spotlight on longstanding issues of inequality, both nationally as well as our communities across the country. In the midst of all this, we've seen that some legislators are more open to discussing these issues than now before, or at least they're more open to hearing from constituents on issues of economic inequality. How have you all been able to use this momentum right now in this current climate to advance your policy priorities?
Well, it is interesting. In some of these issues we've been talking about in general, but now we can put a finer point on them, such as support for minority business development, as opposed to just support for small business development. We're talking more aggressively about the impact of gentrification on historically African American communities, and how we really need to have real strategies to prevent that gentrification. Of course, I mentioned earlier access to broadband in under-resourced African American communities, because the health and the educational gap is huge in those areas. And so the focus on broadband and making sure broadband is available to these under-resourced communities is critical. And just as an aside, our governor, and some of this is because of the availability of CARE Act stimulus money. Our governor has just dedicated a certain amount of money, can't remember the millions of dollars, that will be going to our historically Black colleges and universities in South Carolina, which have historically been under-resourced by the state, under-invested by the state. But all of a sudden, the governor is now putting some money available, although it's COVID CARE Act stimulus money, but he's dedicating some of those dollars for historically Black colleges and universities, which we all have been advocating that needs more state support. And so hopefully this sets the stage for more of that to happen.
Absolutely, and that's incredible in South Carolina. So Bernie, I want to give you a second to catch your breath, maybe get a drink of water. I have a couple questions that are coming in. So while you do that, I want to, and then attendees, if you all will continue to send your questions in. But in the meantime, I just remembered the person that asked earlier, if you're still on, getting sort of a model template for emails and for correspondence with legislators, in addition to Prosperity Now's resources that we put out. We also want to encourage you to join our Facebook Action Center as well as our advocacy listservs. Those are great places to just ask these types of questions to other advocates across the country, to get templates and those type of things from people who are doing similar work to you. You should have received a newsletter, our Camp Prosperity newsletter yesterday, which has a link to both of those things, both the Facebook Action Center and our advocacy listserv. So yeah, I definitely encourage you to utilize those two places to ask these questions and to get templates and feedback and just advice from other advocates. So with that, I'll get to some of your audience questions. The first, Bernie, I'm going to kick to you, which is, how can I approach another organization and begin building those relationships to create a stronger base for advocacy?
It's a great question, and I would say you want to be strategic as to who you want to engage with. If you're talking about legislators, you may want to see what are the other entities that influence legislators. For us, we knew the bankers associations, the Chamber of Commerce had great sway with the legislature. And so since we have bankers on our board, we have relationships with the banking sector, we were able to get them on our side in advocating for certain issues that we're promoting. With the conservation sector, for example, it was a long time. It took us really about a year to have ongoing dialogue, ongoing conversation, structured dialogue, so that we could appreciate each other's agenda, appreciate and understand each other's nomenclature. One cultural difference for us was that the conservation partners, once they thought they understood what kind of work we were doing, they were ready to, okay, let's do a project together. And we said, whoa, 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 whoa. We need to understand a little bit more about how you go about your work. So it took us a little time, but that investment of time of understanding each other's organizational culture, each other's agendas, and so forth, was time well spent that it now enables us to really move forward holistically to advance both our work and their work. So sometimes it is something you can do pretty easily, and sometimes it just takes structured, facilitated dialogue with that other organization or that other sector. We now are developing, I think, a great partnership with a group that deals with women's reproductive rights issues, and they see our issues as compatible. And so we're developing that relationship with that organization, and they have a huge grassroots network, and so we're working together there. So gender inequality is also an issue, and we put forward those disparities as well as we are talking to legislators.
Thanks so much for that thorough answer, Bernie. I've got some more questions trickling in. I'm going to try this. It sounds like this one is from a new advocate, and Bernie, Heather, feel free to chime in where you see fit. But the question is, when we call a legislator, do we talk to them directly, and how do we know they will act on what we want done? So I'll answer this first. When you call a legislator, you will more likely, most of the time, speak with one of their staffers, especially your federal legislator. You'll likely speak to a very junior level staffer, a staff assistant, if you're talking about calling someone on Capitol Hill. And that person will take your concerns. It's best to be as specific as possible in talking about, if you're talking about a bill, you definitely want to mention the bill number, but also mention what you want that legislator to do. So you'll mention the bill number, perhaps include a personal story, maybe some data, but also to Heather's point earlier in the hand, making sure you leave a specific ask for that legislator. That staffer will in turn report that information to the legislator. At the end of the day, I worked on Capitol Hill. I started my career there, and we would send our phone logs to our legislator throughout the day just to keep them posted on what folks are asking about. So that's kind of the process. To the second part of that question, how do we know that they will act on it? Again, they'll have this information. These phone calls inform, and I can speak to my legislator that I work with on Capitol Hill, will inform the decision making. A lot of times they'll just want to see what advocates or what constituents are calling about what, to be able to inform some of the work that they're doing. And if you want a response from the legislator, indicate that in the call as well. Or if you're just calling to comment, say that as well. But Bernie, do you have anything to add there?
Sure. One thing I would say before I forget it is, over time, you want the legislator to view you as the expert. So a lot of it's going to depend on how well you address these issues and how credible you are with your work. Now, at a state level, I always take the position that legislators work for you. So yes, the first touch is going to be to a staffer. Sometimes it's just going to be the scheduler, but you should be polite. You should be mindful of their time, but definitely engage that legislator, especially if they are your legislator representing your district. Please engage them directly. The thing you always have to remember, and this is something I learned some time ago, legislators have thousands of issues confronting them. So first of all, for them to remember everything about your agenda or someone else's agenda is going to be difficult. So keep in mind they have a lot of information and a lot of issues that they're confronting. You want to help them to understand the importance of your issue, and you want them to appreciate you as an expert, so that as that issue moves forward, they know that they can go to you to get data about it, especially if they're writing legislation or if they're trying to get money in the budget. So engage them, help them to understand and appreciate you as the expert on the issue, and then begin to send them information about the impact of your work or the impact of your agenda on the state's economy or on the state's sense of well-being and prosperity. But position yourself as the expert on that issue.
Absolutely agree with that, Bernie. Very well said. And I'll add too to that, that, I know that we've talked about reaching more conservative legislators or folks who don't agree with you. To the tail end of Bernie's point, I definitely agree with demonstrating impact. If you've got a legislator who you agree with on policy issues, it's easy to talk to them about the good stuff. But for opposing legislators, that's always a good point of communication with them, is showing them the impact of bad policy on the community. And that could be a good inroad for you, is just providing that data and research on how policy has hurt constituents in their community. Heather, anything to add? I know that you've been quiet here, but I'm going to go.
I was going to say, I think you guys tackled anything that I would have mentioned, but certainly would have just underscored the ask part. If you're really eager for a callback, the ask.
Great. And I see several people are asking for the recording and the slides. They will definitely be available to you by the end of the week, as well as in Monday's newsletter, which you all will receive because you've registered for this webinar series. Other questions here, I want to get to them and keep them coming in. Can you all speak to any specific data points or themes that you have used to inform your messaging related to return on investment, particularly in housing?
Sure. So there's a wealth of information ranging from the Federal Reserve, and I should have mentioned this earlier, that the Federal Reserve, depending on where you're located, whether it's the Federal Reserve of Richmond, Federal Reserve of Atlanta, Pittsburgh, they are a wealth of information for data and how you report data on housing. And so I would encourage you, and you can just go to their homepage, and they have reports coming out regularly, and you can even search for reports on housing, on jobs. So I encourage that. When it comes to return on investment in housing, pretty much there are some templates out there that can show you the return on investment as far as jobs created. There's some models that are used to show that based on the investment in housing, based on the number of units created, it usually is going to generate X number of jobs. And so those are templates that you can use to demonstrate the impact of housing on the state's economy and on creating jobs in the area. And some of that data, depending on the organizations that's doing the housing, of course, Habitat for Humanities is kind of the universal provider of affordable housing. They're going to be able to tell you oftentimes what that return on investment is in housing. So if you're an advocate for affordable housing, some of the community development corporations will have that data as well. But yeah, you'll be able to find that data through local organizations like Habitats or CDCs, or national organizations like the Federal Reserve Bank System, as well as the Home Builders Association. Both local association and National Home Builders Association will definitely have those models to show the return on investment in housing.
I think too, another data resource that we often use are think tanks. If you're trying to reach a conservative lawmaker, however, I would, push you toward a more conservative think tank that they may value. You may not want to go to a conservative, lawmaker with data from Brookings, but they may be open to data from Third Way, which is really moderate, or Cato. So I think think tanks are another good resource, especially for housing, to consider when looking for data.
Thank you both. Another question here we have, and I'm assuming this is directed at Bernie. Do you have a compiled list of African-American banks and lenders that you can share?
I can definitely get that. I think I do have that list, but I can definitely get it from the Federal Reserve. There are what they call minority development institutions that are out there, and so I can get that to Vanna and Tupa, so that they can share it with you. For example, in South Carolina, we have Optus Bank, which is the only minority African-American controlled bank in the state. North Carolina has an African-American controlled bank. I think Farmers and Merchants or Farmers and Mechanics is the bank in North Carolina. But there is a list, it's a shrinking list, but there is a list of African-American controlled banks in the country.
Great, thank you, Bernie. Another question here that is directed at you, Bernie, but Heather, I know that you've got a lot of experience in this area too. How do we integrate racial justice when doing advocacy?
One of the ways that we often do it is, and this goes back to who is your messenger. So we try and use the voices of people who are directly impacted by racial justice, right? So whether it's criminal justice, whether it's housing policies, we always try and reach lawmakers through those who are directly impacted when doing advocacy work. So for example, we've been doing a lot of work with people who are formerly incarcerated in pushing for policy changes around all things criminal justice, right? So people who can speak to a message from somebody who has been impacted by the criminal justice system is very different than a data scientist, a faith person, right? So it's those first person stories when doing racial justice work that I think are really valuable. It doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who is formerly incarcerated. I think the voices of people who maybe have been harassed or abused by police officers, people who have been detained by ICE, someone who has been denied a job that's rooted in race or denied housing that's rooted in race. So I think one thing to consider when doing advocacy work that's racial justice focused is making sure that you're centering the voices of people who have been directly impacted by the piece, the project or the issue area that you're advocating for.
Yeah, and I would also say, and Heather covered it beautifully, I'd also say that a lot of this requires education, requires bringing forward facts that folk just didn't know. A book I would encourage you to secure is called The Color of Law. It is a great piece that looks at, it spends a lot of time on housing issues, but it looks at the policies that have been put in place by, of course, the federal government, but also state and local governments to deny people of color from housing in different communities. But it also sprinkles in some other issues related to inequities and injustice or lack of injustices. So I would say this is one of those areas where you have to look at the long view and put in place a consistent program to help educate folk about past injustices and how it affects us today. One of the issues that we have been helping folk to understand in South Carolina is the history of law enforcement in the South. And a lot of people just don't know that the law enforcement, the genesis of law enforcement in the South goes back to the 16 and 1700s, mainly the 1700s, with slave catchers. And how slave catchers came about, they were citizens that were deputized by the state to go after runaway slaves. And so when the question is raised, why is there a disconnect between communities of color and law enforcement? It's not paranoia by communities of color. It's almost part of the history of communities of color. So that when I see a police cruiser riding behind me, I don't think that they're there to protect and serve me. I think they're there to come after me. So it's helping folk to understand the truths that have been there all the time, and helping them to connect with how those truths impact us today. Another issue that some of our members have used to affect policy is around expungement, and how it's important to with the high incarceration rate of African Americans, when African Americans have served their time and they're now out, how their records need to be expunged so that they can gain meaningful employment, so that they can secure the right kind of capital for their businesses. And working with conservative legislators, some of our members were able to convince them to get an expungement legislation passed in the state. And through that, they've been able to mitigate some of the disparities when it comes to ex-offenders who are African Americans in South Carolina. So justice and equity has to be part and parcel to the work that we're doing around policy and advocacy.
I would definitely co-sign on Color of Law, a book I just started, I just started reading Tiffany Cross's book. She's been filling in for Joy Reid on the weekends. Many of you have probably seen her on MSNBC. She's a longtime contributor, but she just published a book called Say It Louder, Black Voters, White Narratives, and Saving Our Democracy. So I'm only about 2.5 chapters in. I just got it a couple days ago. But I think it's a really interesting modern take on where we are in this moment. So certainly a book I'd recommend for your summer reading list that can kind of help tee up some good strategic thinking as we head into what will be a sprint to election day for sure.
And if I can offer a third book just to kind of give a personal journey, someone's personal journey, if it's the adage, if but the grace of God go there, but the grace of God go I. It's Wes Moore's book, The Other Wes Moore. Yep. We were fortunate to have him as our keynote speaker at our conference last year, and his book on The Other Wes Moore, I think, is a wonderful journey to help you understand that identity and what's the importance of identity. And I won't go into the details or the narrative or the theme of the book, but that's another one I would add to your summer reading.
I would second The Other Wes Moore. We have a final question that I want to get to really quickly, and then I see, Carmela, you're offering up a book. Thomas Boston's book called Race, Class, and Conservatism is excellent. So throwing it out there again by Thomas Boston, Race, Class, and Conservatism. Thanks for sharing that. Final question here for you, Bernie, and then I want to get into some next steps. Can you speak more on your experience integrating housing advocacy with food and conservation?
Well, in short, it's all part of a comprehensive look, but we look at these elements, and maybe I look at these elements as all critical to a true and prosperous society and a true and prosperous culture. I'm old enough to remember the food network that existed in my community, and all of the folk in my community either owned their homes or were part of a home ownership culture. And so I guess I'm a little concerned about our food infrastructure now, our food chain now. COVID-19 has raised the ire or the specter of how something like a pandemic can interrupt our food supply, because our food supply is international. So what we're concerned about and needing to look at is alternatives, which includes creating a local food networks. That also is the same for housing and home ownership, that we need to create an ownership culture, and an ownership society that will ensure everyone has a decent place to live, everyone has food that they can access that is healthy, that is affordable. And so all of this is critical to a prosperous and thriving society. You have folk in our leaders in our society that, to them, these are non-issues because they always have easy access to food. But this is why site visits, and this is why bringing people into the local space and helping them to understand that there are disruptions in the systems that we look at as a prosperous life. And so by making sure that they understand that food, shelter, education, access to capital are all interwoven to make sure that a local community is thriving and is able to be sustainable over time.
Thank you, Bernie. And if you and Heather would take a moment to think about some final thoughts that you want to offer up, I want to go through some next steps. So Tupa, if you'll advance the slide, I do want to leave everyone with ways to stay in touch with both Heather and Bernie. You can see their contact information there on the screen. You can feel free to screenshot it before I move on. And there's also my email address there for you all as well. And then in terms of next steps, I encourage you all to please complete the follow-up survey that we sent out. We always want to try to improve these webinars every week and make sure you're getting the most out of them. So please complete the survey. Of course, our next webinar is going to be on next Tuesday. It's going to cover influencing your state's budget during times of crisis. So a very timely webinar. I hope that all of you will be back to join us next week. And not only do I encourage you all to be back, but I encourage you to bring 2 friends with you. It's such a timely webinar. We've got some great speakers lined up. As always, visit our website for more resources. And then also want to encourage you all, if you haven't already, register for our 2020 Prosperity Summit. For those of you who have attended the in-person summit in the past, although we are virtual this year, the content still will be just as good. We've got ways to make that virtual experience feel as interactive as possible through the platform that we're going to be using. And then if you all want to connect and go deeper with folks around the country who are interested in some of the issues that you see here, our Affordable Homeownership Network, racial wealth equity, so on and so forth, we encourage you to join these networks. You can see the link there at the bottom, prosperitynow.org/get involved. So we encourage you to join these networks to get more involved. And then you all do have the information about joining our advocacy center. These are the issues, the 4 policy issues that we work on at Prosperity Now. So feel free to reach out to me for more on these issues. The Advocacy Center, as you all can see again there, and then our Prosperity Summit, a nice, beautiful graphic to encourage you all to go to the website and learn more about what's going to be covered at the 2020 Prosperity Summit. So lastly, I want to kick it back over to Bernie, Heather, offer up an opportunity for you all to give final thoughts, closing thoughts before we wrap up.
Probably my only final thoughts are it's an election year. It's going to be a wild year. Reaching members of the media, reaching lawmakers has never been more challenging, just given the climate that we're in. We're just not operating in any sense of normal. So I think knowing who your messengers are and what your message is has never been more important. So if you feel like you're kind of hitting a wall in terms of reaching people, it might be a great time to consider, do we have a fresh set of messengers who may be better messengers, and a fresh set of messages as well to achieve whatever our goals may be through the end of the year, especially obviously long term, but through the end of the year is really probably as far as most of us can think right now.
And I guess my closing thought comes from Majority Whip Congressman Jim Clyburn of the U.S. House of Representatives from South Carolina. He keynoted our 20th anniversary conference 6 years ago. And the theme he kept hammering with us back then was we have to stay vigilant because we can't take for granted that progress that has been made will not erode. And I think we can see today, over the last 3 years and even now, that we thought, or some of us may have thought, that we've gone beyond and have experienced a post-racial culture. That is not true. So we have to be vigilant to organizing. We have to be vigilant in voting and putting people in office that represent our values. We have to be vigilant in telling the truth about what's going on, what's happening, who we are. And we have to be vigilant about holding leaders accountable. So I am very excited and hopeful of the movement that's underway now. And I only want to encourage us all to be fully engaged, leaning forward in all levels, and to make sure that everything from participating in the census to registering folk to vote, to taking folk to the polls, to being in front of elected officials now. There's no better time than now. And I thank you all for the work that you do, and I thank Prosperity Now for its leadership.
Great, and I am going to kick that thanks back over to you and Heather for joining us today. Incredible insights and expertise that you all provided, and we're just grateful for you all lending your time today. So with that, everyone have a great rest of your afternoon, and we look forward to having you join our next webinar on next Tuesday. So thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.